Now, okay, I'm sorry. Now, how does that differ from being quarantined if you refuse to take a vaccine, as opposed to being quarantined because you've been exposed to a virus in quarantine? You know.
Well, I think the language there under presidential executive orders is that the president can deem anyone he so chooses as a threat to public health. So, in other words, for the simple reason that a person refused a vaccine, they could be called a threat to public health and detained. The language in the executive order is detained and or arrested. So again, it means the same thing, that a citizen of these United States could be under rules of quarantine or under rules of executive orders, be deprived of their personal freedom.
And and it so happens, I understand, even in quarantines, they may not even ask you if you've been vaccinated. So even the people who believe they're protected, because I guess what they don't recognize is the vaccines really don't stop you from getting the infection.
Right. Exactly.
It's just supposed to, I guess, theoretically lessen the burden of the disease or of the infection, but it doesn't stop you. So a vaccinated person, for all intents and purposes, is still a carrier.
Absolutely, because in fact there's a boomerang effect that often occurs with vaccination, that the vaccine actually causes the very disease that it was supposed to protect you against. So in fact, a person may put themselves in greater risk of being quarantined simply because they are vaccinated.
Right. And that's what it looks like is brewing up to be, just looking at the historical pattern.
Yes.
Of how they go about raising these pandemics or epidemics, and this is what makes the vaccination really the biggest threat, because if you have a community where you don't have any incidents of that swine flu, now all of a sudden the whole community is vaccinated, now all of a sudden somebody has a reaction, they're deemed to have the swine flu, now the whole community gets quarantined.
Yes.
But if you left it alone.
Yes. And of course, not to mention the fact that there are many causes of cough and a fever and body aches and headaches and sore throat other than the swine flu.
Yes.
But just on the basis of any of those symptoms, that would be sufficient grounds for a person to be quarantined. Now, the other things related to the status of the virus has to do with the fact that in Egypt recently, 3 individuals were identified as harboring both the H1N1, so-called swine flu, and the bird flu, the H5N1 bird flu.
Right. Now I know you talked about that scenario.
Yes. And along with that, in Chile, in South America, there was a flock of turkeys recently discovered to be harboring the H1N1, and it's also presumed that since they are birds, that they also harbor the H5N1 bird flu.
Oh, okay.
Now, that is a scary development, because H5N1, the so-called bird flu, is not easily transmitted from person to person. There are several hundred bird flu cases that have occurred in human beings over the last 5 years.
Okay.
And there are pockets in Egypt and other places. The mortality rate from bird flu is extremely high. On average, it's around 60%. There are 12 different strains of bird flu. The mortality rate ranges from about 20% all the way up to 80%, depending on the particular strain of bird flu that infects a human being. Now, the saving grace till now has been that it's not easy for a person to transmit the H5N1 bird flu to another person. So it did not seem to have the potential to cause a human epidemic or pandemic. Now, the H1N1, the so-called swine flu, passes very easily between people. And that's why, as we are recording this interview, you have tens of millions of Americans, maybe as many as 100 million people who have already been infected in this country with the swine flu. And around the world, probably hundreds of millions, maybe even approaching 1 billion, have already been infected by H1N1. That's how easily it's transmitted from person to person. Now, the nightmare scenario is in a flock of birds where H1N1 is introduced. Perhaps it will mix with H5N1 in those birds.
Okay.
And then you produce a different virus that now has the lethal characteristics of the bird flu and easy transmissibility between persons.
Right. That's going to be good.
And so of the 3 patients that were discovered in Egypt just last week, one of them died. He had just returned. He had been a pilgrim on Umrah to Mecca, came back to Egypt and became ill and was dead within 24 hours.
Wow.
And then there were 2 other patients who were hospitalized with a very severe illness, but at last report had not yet died. So now if some mixing has occurred, either in those birds in Chile or in these human patients in Egypt, well, now the stage is set for a global pandemic that would just be of unbelievable lethality.
Right, because now you even have the situation where the birds now can transmit the infection to humans.
Yes.
And of course, we know the number of birds, period. I think birds outnumber humans.
Yes.
Maybe somewhere close to 6 to 1 or even something greater than that.
And we probably have a situation now on this planet where every bird can be presumed to be infected with H5N1. Now, it doesn't seem to make birds sick. They're just carriers of it. And people who work with birds are the ones who somehow or other can get that virus from close proximity or work with birds. But now if this reassortment of genes takes place, and H1N1 combines with H5N1, now you have a killer. Just to put things into perspective, the Spanish flu of 1918 had a mortality rate, in other words, a kill rate of 2%. 2% of all the people who got it died. Okay. The rest were made sick, perhaps, but they didn't die. I found out from my mother just the other week that I lost a great uncle. He died in 1918 from influenza. But keep in mind, a 2% mortality rate produced 100 million deaths in 1918 and 1919.
So that means that everybody had it, but the fatality rate wasn't as lethal.
Right. So now what happens if the mortality rate through a new virus is up to 20% or 50% or even higher? Certain virologists, especially in Russia, are saying that if that worst case scenario were to materialize, then we're talking about the deaths of billions of people on the planet, maybe 2 billion at a minimum.
Well, it looks like it's shaping up to be that way. I mean, not based on what you just gave, but even the government's actions. The number of coffins that have been ordered in the tune of millions, the number of body bags that are being stored up in these camps, and even the prediction that we started to see as early as late April.
Yes.
There was an article that said that up to 40% of people would be infected with H1N1, and they already start talking about these high, exorbitant fatality rates. So it looks as though somebody knows that it may be headed in that precise direction.
Well, here's an interesting find. This is a report that was prepared by the U.S. Air Force in 1996, and it is entitled Alternate Futures for 2005, Security Planning to Avoid Surprise.